Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Place Like No Other, Discovering the Secrets of Serengeti, by Anthony Sinclair, with Renee Bayers. Narrated by Shaun Grindell. Preface. This is the narrative of how scientists discovered the rules that produced the unique features of the great Serengeti ecosystem and allowed it to persist. The story begins when Anthony Sinclair, first arrived in the Serengeti as a young student in 1965 and, seeing the magnificence of the place, decided to find out why it was so outstanding and what held it together and made it work. My first job, as an assistant to an Oxford University professor, was to answer the question of how so many migrant birds from the whole of Asia and Europe had managed to fit into the comparatively tiny area of East Africa for the winter. They seemed to be breaking all the rules of ecology. While engaged with this problem, I became aware that the large mammal populations of Serengeti were increasing rapidly, especially the dominant herbivore species of buffalo, wildebeest, and elephant. I was asked to turn my attention to this problem. The increase raised a number of questions fundamental to ecology and essential for conservation. I started with this simple question: why were these species increasing? But this led to more profound questions and discoveries. Perhaps once a decade since then, there has been an important discovery concerning some new aspect that explains how the Serengeti works. These aspects are really all related to one fundamental principle, the principle of regulation, which governs not only Serengeti, but also every other ecosystem of the world. It turned out that there were 7 of these aspects, which we called sub-principles, uncovered over a period of some 50 years. The story of their elucidation is necessarily linear. For the most part, that is how the principles were uncovered. One discovery led to more questions, which led to the next discovery. The principle of regulation was deduced in the 1960s and 70s, bottom-up food limitation in the 1980s, top-down predation and migration in the 1980s and 90s. Biodiversity and stability are a combination of many aspects that came together in the 1990s and 2000s. Disturbance was finally understood in the 2010s, while continuous change became apparent to us from the paleontological work of others at Olduvai Gorge and our own work on vegetation in the 2000s. Our elucidation of multiple states was first formulated in the 1990s, but it made more logical sense to place it at the end because it deals with complex interactions of other principles that had to be explained first. These chapters work toward a synthesis of the sub-principles in Chapter 11. No doubt there are more processes to discover, and we mention also in Chapter 11 some of the interesting problems that will have to be addressed in the future. Regulation and its sub-principles, then, form the basis of our understanding of what has gone wrong in the Serengeti, to explain the consequences of poaching, human intrusions, and the decline in drinking water for animals, for example. Building on this, we use the sub-principles to understand ecosystem malfunctions elsewhere in the world, using examples of each sub-principle. But we cannot leave the story there, in a state of doom and dejection. We have to ask what we, as conservationists, can do about it. We address this in the final chapter. What we do is rewilding, the reconstitution of ecosystems as they would have been had humans not degraded them by overexploitation and disturbance. This book is a description of the Serengeti, not only of what is there, the landscape, vegetation, and animals, but also of how it works. In much the same way, a description of the human body is not just the anatomy, the bones, muscles, skin, and blood, but also how it works, its physiology, its regulatory mechanisms that keep the body together, its behavior, the outside impacts that affect the body, and, above all, its pathology, what goes wrong with it. So also we describe the ecosystem. Its anatomy is the community of species in their environment, but then we need to know how they all stay together, their regulation, what disturbs this combination of species, how it changes, and what goes wrong when parts of the anatomy and physiology are changed, not just in this system, but in other systems around the world, each with its own ecosystem pathology. By understanding this system, we can also understand other systems. The combination species in their environments, the anatomy of the ecosystem, is held together by a set of processes, which we will describe in the following chapters as the 8 principles. most being elaborations on the nuances and complexities of the first principle, regulation. Each of these principles is known from other ecosystems in the world, but Serengeti is one of the few places, if not the only place, that is sufficiently described to show all the principles in one ecosystem. Serengeti is an easy place to observe, describe and record. Its relatively flat terrain, the open vegetation of its plains and savanna, the mild climate, the ease of movement have all allowed scientists to record the changes in the ecosystem over many decades. Many ecologists have worked here since the 1950s. We report on what they have found in terms of the questions we ask about how the system works. We write this account for the broader human society, to show why it is important to understand how an ecosystem works. If you don't know how it works, you don't know how to look after it. Bill Robichaud, now president of the Saola Foundation and a former student of mine who works in Laos, described how a juvenile of an ungulate new to science was brought into captivity and fed a starchy gruel, on which it died. This was the first specimen of the Saola, a primitive relative of the cow, ever seen alive. But because the people did not know how to look after it, it perished. The same argument applies to entire ecosystems. We will show how the wrong husbandry has resulted in the collapse of many ecosystems around the world. This is the legacy of past generations in fragile ecosystems on islands, even large ones such as Australia and New Zealand, as well as on continents. If only they knew 150 years ago what we know now. Occasionally we refer to a scientist by name when reference is necessary. Similarly, we have, wherever possible, left out the scientific names, unless no common name exists. This is the account of how the different processes that drive the Serengeti ecosystem came to light over 5 decades. Many scientists have a study system to test their theories, and Serengeti is the one I used. In essence, it is a detective story showing how we came to understand the workings of the ecosystem, complete with theories, false starts, wrong directions, hard facts, remarkable luck, and surprising outcomes. We hope to show that Serengeti and other large protected areas act as the baselines against which we can monitor the tempo of human ecosystems to judge their stability and persistence. They act as the insurance policy for humankind, without which we cannot judge what we are doing to our world. Without these baselines, we are blind to events. But many natural systems that have been degraded by human actions need to be repaired through rewilding, so that they can act as baselines. The principles deduced from the study of Serengeti can be applied to most other ecosystems, both to understand their problems and to offer clues as to how to repair them. Serengeti shows that natural systems can repair themselves from major disturbances, even total collapse, if allowed time, protection, and perhaps a little help. That is the punchline from this book. Anthony Sinclair and Renee Bayers, April 2021. 1. Why Serengeti? A World Heritage. In 1972, the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment in Stockholm developed the Convention concerning the protection of the world cultural and natural heritage. Later in 1972, former U.S. Secretary of the Interior Stuart Udall, a passionate advocate for the environment, who also served as U.S. representative to the Stockholm Conference, visited Serengeti. I met him there, took him around the park and discussed the future. He recounted the events in Stockholm earlier that year. A debate had developed over how to choose World Heritage sites. As a first attempt, delegates were asked to retire for the evening and drop a list of their top 10 preferred sites around the world. Next day, all the lists were collated, and the one with most votes, the top of the list, was the Serengeti ecosystem. It was voted the most important natural area in the world. Serengeti is outstanding for its biodiversity, its great migrations, and its iconic megafauna of large mammals. It is one of the last remaining relatively intact examples in the modern world of the last ice age, or Pleistocene. Why is Serengeti so different from any other place? Why is it regarded as the most important natural ecosystem in the world? All heritage sites are unique in their own ways, so why does this one stand out? We know from paleontology that the main aspects of Serengeti have been around for a long time, some 4 million years at least. There must have been a set of conditions and processes that create special features of Serengeti and that result in its persistence over long periods. Over the last 50 years or so, a group of scientists has worked to elucidate these processes, which are governed by what we have termed principles. What makes Serengeti both outstanding and spectacular? What are the environmental features that allow a migration of so many animals? What determines the sizes of animal populations and the diversity of species that live there? Indeed, why does it have so many species? These are some of the questions we will consider here as we explore the biology of Serengeti. Using these principles, we can understand the problems facing Serengeti today and what might happen to it in the future. These principles will also allow us to understand how problems in other areas of the world have developed and, finally, how we can repair them. The Serengeti is defined by the area across which the wildebeest migrate. Serengeti is now a household name, the epitome of a wildlife spectacle in Pleistocene surroundings. Surprisingly, it has only recently came to be known thus. It was the lions that first attracted attention in the 1920s, lions to be hunted by foreigners, and the wildebeest migration was completely unknown. The Serengeti Plains were the place to go for the grandest black-maned lions in the world, and there were lots of them to shoot. It was not until the Germans, Bernhard Grzimek and his son Michael, flew their plane over the Serengeti in the late 1950s to document the great migration in their film, and book of the same name, Serengeti Shall Not Die, that the world first became aware of the phenomenon. The Serengeti is significant because it supports one of the last remaining migrations of large mammals in a relatively unchanged state from the time of the hunter-gatherers, long before the agricultural development that gradually emerged in the 1600s from the Congo, far outside Serengeti, and before the impacts of the modern economic world were felt. It is also a place of singular beauty and remarkable biodiversity. It supports more large mammal species than any other place in the world, and almost as many bird species as the whole of Europe. Despite its relatively undisturbed state, the ecology of the Serengeti has changed over the past century, and these changes highlight its fragility and sensitivity to climate and human impacts. Serengeti is a place where biologists can observe nature more easily than most. Its combination of open plains and savanna allows access to most of the area. The large animals are readily observable. One can describe their ecology and behavior using only binoculars. Their populations can be counted accurately. Because of the many decades biologists have been studying the Serengeti, we now understand the causes underlying the huge changes that occurred in the ecosystem, both in the distant past and during the past century. By now, nearly everyone knows that human impacts on nature are becoming ever more severe, and Serengeti has become a case study documenting these impacts. Long-term studies have shown how political, economic and social events have driven the ecological changes. Serengeti has become a vital source of information for science on how ecosystems work and how they respond to pressures. My involvement in Serengeti began on July 1, 1965, driving south from Nairobi through the Masai Mara Park to Banagi, the research headquarters of a small band of biologists in the center of Serengeti National Park. My job was to record the bird migrations from Asia as an assistant to Professor A.J. Kane of Oxford University. He had projects elsewhere in Africa and left me to it for 3 months. I was given a small round house to live in. My first morning at dawn, I accompanied the park warden's driver while he read all the rain gauges scattered around the park, a job that was done at the end of each month. It was the first of 3 days of rain gauge reading, and in that time we covered the whole of Serengeti, some 20,000 square kilometers. At the end of those 3 days, I had seen the Serengeti as few non-natives had ever done. In the past, I had seen something of East Africa, having been raised there, and had visited various game parks, but nothing had prepared me for this experience of wildlife in vast numbers, the extraordinary migrations, the sheer diversity of animals and vegetation, and the spectacular landscapes. There had to be a reason why Serengeti was such an outstanding place, and I decided to find out, to discover the conditions, the processes, and the underlying principles that made Serengeti the way it is. But this system, though unique, shares many features with other ecosystems in the world, making it a model for understanding ecological processes. The principles are useful not just to explain how Serengeti itself works, in its unusual, even aberrant form. In understanding this ecosystem, we can begin to make sense of all other systems by recognizing how they differ from Serengeti. They are the other side of the coin. This book recounts the history of how these principles were discovered. Perhaps the best way to begin is with a brief description of the Serengeti ecosystem. Its special geographic features determine its physical environment, climate, water relations, and habitats. Together, these create the conditions that make possible the great migration of wildebeest and other species. The Serengeti Mara ecosystem is an area of approximately 25,000 square kilometers on the border of Tanzania and Kenya in East Africa, and its extent is defined by the movements of the migratory wildebeest. This includes many political administrations. The main ones in Tanzania are the Serengeti National Park, SNP itself, and the Ngorongoro Conservation Area, NCA, which lies east of the park and includes half of the Serengeti Plains. North of the NCA is the district of Loliondo. The Masai Mara Reserve is the main Kenyan administration. This area holds the vital dry season grazing and water supplies for the migration. South and west of SNP are small game reserves, such as Maswa, Grumeti, and Ikorongo. Most of the ecosystem consists of a flat or rolling landscape, highly dissected by small seasonal streams that flow into a few major rivers. It is part of the high plateau of interior East Africa. This gentle aspect slopes from the edge of the Gregory Rift in the east down to Lake Victoria in the west, so that all the rivers, except the Olduvai on the plains, flow west. The highest part of the plains is at an altitude of 1,800 meters, while Speke Gulf in the west is at 1,200 meters. There are three major rivers, the most important being the Mara, which originates in the montane forests of the Mau highlands of Kenya. It has until recently flowed year-round, providing the main water supply for the great herds of migrating animals in the dry season. It flows through the Mara Reserve of Kenya and northern Serengeti, and eventually flows west through the huge Masiara Swamp into Lake Victoria at Mosoma. The two other rivers are the Grumeti, which originates in the highlands of northeastern Serengeti, and the Mbelageti, which originates on the Serengeti Plains. Both are seasonal rivers with only pools remaining in the dry season. Two more rivers originate in southern Serengeti, the Simiyu and the Duma, but only their upper reaches lie within the Serengeti before they flow through agricultural land to Speke Gulf. All other rivers dry out except for a few springs that seep from the base of hills. Steep, rocky hills occur along the eastern boundary of SNP, and between the Grumeti and Mbelageti rivers in the west, forming a backbone to the corridor between the rivers. The Enaraboro Plateau, with a high 300-metre escarpment, occurs in the southwest. Because of the generally higher elevation in the east, the hills in Loliondo and the northeast of SMP reach 2,000 metres. The ecosystem is effectively self-contained, enclosed by natural boundaries on all sides but one. The eastern boundary is formed by the escarpment of the Gregory Rift and the base of the Crater Highlands. The south is bounded by the edge of the Serengeti Plains, and in Maswa by the appearance of numerous kopjes, rocky outcrops. In the west, the corridor, which is largely an alluvial plain formed by the rivers, is bounded on both its south and north by higher ground, now agricultural land, and by Speke Gulf. The west of the northern extension of Serengeti to the Kenya border is an artificial boundary set by agriculture. Within Kenya, the Mara Reserve is bounded by the Asuria Escarpment, the Loita Plains, and the Loita Hills. The Serengeti ecosystem is, very roughly, a square, with the treeless plains covering the bottom right quarter, about 5,000 square kilometres. They were formed by dust deposits from the volcanoes of the Crater Highlands 4 million years ago. To understand how this happened, we have to go back to the Miocene, some 14 million years ago, when eastern Africa began to split apart due to plate tectonics. The the same process that split Africa from South America starting 100 million years ago. Africa is still breaking apart, and in a few million years will be two continents. The split is developing down a rift, the Great Rift Valley, from the Dead Sea in the Near East through Ethiopia to East Africa. In East Africa, this rift splits into two arms. The western arm, called the Albertine Rift, runs along the western borders of Uganda, Tanzania, and Mozambique. Within it lie the deep lakes Albert, Tanganyika, and Malawi. The eastern arm, the Gregory Rift, runs through the middle of Kenya and Tanzania. The edges of each rift are uplifted, so that the land between the two forms a shallow basin. Lake Victoria is impounded in this basin, essentially a vast and shallow puddle only about 65 metres deep at its greatest depth. At 65,000 square kilometres, it is huge, the largest lake in Africa, and the third largest in the world after Lake Superior and the Caspian Sea, which is in fact a lake. It is some 300 kilometres across, both west and north. Over time, the rifting resulted in volcanoes, and the crater highlands of Ngorongoro, made up of several different volcanoes, developed. These were very active 4 million years ago, during the Pliocene period. Prevailing winds from the Indian Ocean in the east blew the dust westward. It settled out, deeper, close to the volcanoes, and gradually becoming shallower as it was blown farther west. Eventually this dust hardened into an impenetrable layer of calcium, a hard pan called calcareous tuff, close to the surface. Tree roots cannot penetrate this, and so cannot take hold, but grasses and herbs, especially creeping ones, can establish themselves. The volcanic soil was rich in nutrients, especially nitrogen, phosphorus and calcium, and the creeping plants became highly nutritious. The volcanoes are quiet now, but one, Oldonyo Lengai, is still active, with significant dust fallout in 1966 and 2007. The Ngorongoro crater itself is a caldera, the sunken base of an old volcano. Far enough west from the volcanoes, the hard pan becomes sufficiently thin and broken up that trees can get their roots through and establish themselves. This produces something unusual in ecology, a very narrow boundary between trees on one side and no trees on the other. This boundary, only a few meters wide, runs along the northern, southern and western sides of the plains. Serenera, the park headquarters, lies in the corner of the western and northern boundaries. The geology from the edge of the plains westward and toward the centre of the park is largely ancient granite, with sediments from hills and rivers. Climate. There are two special climatic features that determine the Serengeti environment. First, the crater highlands in the southeast are sufficiently high, 2,400 metres, that they impede the prevailing winds from the Indian Ocean, causing a rain shadow on their western side, where precipitation is scarce. The far eastern Serengeti plains, therefore, are semi-arid, receiving only 500 millimetres of rain per year. Sand dunes are gradually moving across that region. The second important feature is Lake Victoria in the west. This lake is so large that it creates its own weather system. Rainstorms develop over the lake and affect the west and northwest of the ecosystem, even during the dry season. So there is a wet northwestern region and a dry southeastern region, producing a marked gradient in rainfall. It is this gradient that drives the migration and ultimately determines the working of the entire ecosystem. Serengeti is a highly seasonal environment, with rainfall being the major influence. Rain is determined by the position of the sun. Serengeti is near the equator, lying just 2 degrees south. The sun passes over it on its way south in September and on its way north in March. About 6 weeks after the sun passes, a band of heated air, the intertropical convergence zone, follows the sun and draws in wet air from the Indian Ocean. As a result, there are 2 wet seasons, a shorter one in November and December, and a longer one from March to June. Both seasons are variable, the shorter one often absent, but sometimes the two merge to form one long wet season, as occurs when there is a strong El Niño event in the Pacific Ocean. There is a long dry season from July to October. July is the driest month, giving way to storms that become more frequent in the subsequent months in the northwest of the system. In addition, Lake Victoria contributes rain from storms generated by heating over the lake. Habitats. We can think of Serengeti as having three major habitats, which, by coincidence, lie along the rainfall gradient. First, there are the plains in the southeast, which, as already mentioned, are formed by a calcareous layer under the soil derived from volcanoes long ago. This layer prevents trees from growing, and so the plains are open grassland. However, there is also a gradient of grassland types within the plains. The Far Eastern plains are very short grasslands, composed roughly of 40% grasses and sedges, 40% small flowering herbs, and the rest bare ground. All these plants are heavily grazed, though they grow close to the ground as protection from being eaten. In the middle of the plains, the grasses are longer, 30 centimetres, mixed also with flowering shrubs. These are the intermediate plains. To the west and north lie the long grass plains, where the grasses grow up to a metre. The Salai plains form the northern half of the eastern grasslands in the Loliondo district. They are very dry and contain sand dunes, most of them covered with tussock grass, except for some that are still moving. The second habitat, the acacia savanna, starts abruptly at the edge of the plains as the effect of the volcanic soil disappears. The majority of the savanna is formed by many species of African acacias, often a single species stands. Each has its own preferred position along a gradient of drainage. The gently rolling landscape results in well-drained ridgetops with sandy soils. The soil type changes progressively down the slope, until poorly drained and even waterlogged silt soils are found at the bottom, near rivers and drainage lines. The African acacia species lie along this gradient. Umbrella trees, Vachellia Acacia tortilis, prefer the tops. Stinkbark acacia, Vachellia robusta, prefers midslope, while yellow fever trees, Vachellia xanthophylla, like wet soils near rivers, and gall acacias, Vachellia depranolobium, Vachellia seal, live in waterlogged swampy soils. These are just a few of the many tree species that occur here. The grass layer is composed of species similar to those on the long grass plains, but under trees there are other species together with many flowering herbs. The grass layer in the savanna is much richer in species than on the plains. Along riverbanks and around koppies are shrubs that form thickets, favourite hiding places for predators. The third major habitat is the broad-leaved woodland of the far northwest, composed mainly of trees of the genera Terminalia and Combretum. The soils are derived from granite and, though poor in nutrients, support tall grasses, up to 2 metres, and many different species of shrubs. There are also special habitats. The western end of the corridor was, until a few thousand years ago, under Lake Victoria. It is now a flat floodplain, the Ndabaka, with alternating clay soils and sandy ridges, old beaches. It floods during the rains. The hills in the centre of the park on the Nyaraboro Plateau and along the eastern boundary are stony or have thin soils. Species of Combretum are found on lower slopes, but a mixture of small acacias and shrubs grow higher up. On the higher hills of the northeast, such as Kuka Hill, the elevation results in montane forest, a relic of that on the Crater Highlands and the Loita Hills in Kenya. Most of this forest has been destroyed by fire over the past century, and the hills are now covered by grassland, but small patches of forest remain in gullies where fire cannot reach. The Mara River supports riverine forest, which is an extension of the montane forest downstream from the highlands in Kenya, where the river has its source. This is closed canopy forests maintained by a high water table from the river. It can be half a kilometre wide, but more usually is 50 metres or less in width. There is evidence it was much more extensive in past centuries. The Grumeti and Mbelageti rivers along the western corridor also support forest, but this is forest of a completely different type. It is a subset of the lowland Congo forest and has almost no overlap in tree species with the Mara montane forest. The Serengeti thus supports two major forest types, only 50 kilometres apart. The rocky outcrops or koppies found in the eastern half of the ecosystem are granite intrusions and are surrounded by a matrix of volcanic rocks. These small islands of rock support dense shrubs and broad-leaved trees such as marula, Sclerocaria birrea, and fig trees. ficus species. Vegetation is scarce on the kopjes of the eastern plains, but lush on those at Moru, an area of large kopjes at the western edge of the plains in the south of the park.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?